G'day and welcome back to Drafted, talking all things SuperCoach Draft on the official SuperCoach podcast feed. We are talking forward ranks today. We've got Lekdog back on deck. How's it going, Lek?
I'm well, mate. It's a nice warm afternoon in Melbourne and we are just raring for the preseason games to start.
Cannot wait. Yes. Well, I think by the time this is released, they might even be out or starting today. So I think this will be going out on a Saturday morning. We are recording a little bit earlier in the week. Apologies if there's any injury concerns. Last time we did the Ruck podcast, released it, and then within days, Shawnee Darcy was back down and I'd talked him up. So hopefully we don't get a similar situation. But yeah, practice games up and happening. We've got another man back on deck for his second podcast this preseason on Drafted. Stevie Fizz from the Draft Doctors. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. Very excited. Love talking forwards. It's no one else likes talking, but we'll get down into the down and dirty, down into the gutter, and talk about some players we just don't want to draft, but will.
Well, you have to. Unfortunately, we do have to draft these forwards. Yeah, if you're looking at your draft ranks right now, it is tough. There's a couple at the top you might be interested in, but then it gets thin real quick. Stevie Fizz, where do we look to draft and fill out our draft teams in the forward line? And, you know, what sort of strategy are you looking at in particular in 2025?
So I always try to find one who I quite like in the top part of my draft, because I don't want to go in with a really bad F1. I think that's, if you're waiting on forwards till the end of the earth, you're just going to find yourself in a bad spot. I try to find myself an F2 who is going to be solid. And then what I like to do, if you're playing in, say, a five, you need 5 forwards, I really like to pepper the last few rounds of the draft and try to find some guys who maybe have increased opportunity and increased market share. And I'm trying to snare a couple of those guys and hope one of them, even two, pay off for me. Otherwise, I'll tend to just play matchups. So I like taking a lot of shots late on forwards in my draft, but I certainly want to square one away early days.
Keen to hear your thoughts on some of those late sleepers at the end of the show. But Lekdog, are you similar in Steve in the way you approach forwards?
If you can get a good one, grab him. I think there's only really one worth taking in the first round and maybe one worth taking in the second round. If I miss out on a couple of the guys that go a little early, I don't mind. But I just punt forwards every single year. And we were talking before the podcast, I draft Lincoln McCarthy and I draft Treacy and I draft, Brian Myers, and then you end up with a relatively solid output anyway. I just try and bridge the gap with primo mids or high-scoring defenders. But, the forwards are fun to talk about because it's not as obvious as some of the other positions. So, open your eyes, people. Alex Neil-Bullen's great.
Oh, okay. We're about to get into it. Let's get stuck into your ranks. We are going to go through the top 30 forwards, which seems a bit more daunting than some of the other positions to go 30 deep, but we are going to do it on the show today. And as we have been doing on all the drafted episodes, we're going to go off Lekdog's ranks, which you can find on Code Sports right now. You can get his top 100 ranks. I'll put a link in the description for that if you want to jump and have a look at those. He's also got the tiered rankings as we go through this system. But Lekdog, let's take away your 1 to 10 and then we'll discuss those ranks.
Too easy. Well, tier 1 is Jason Horne-Francis. I don't think there's any surprises there. Wasn't even in my top 100 last year and has made me eat humble pie. Tier 2 on his own is Dylan Moore from Hawthorn. Tier 3, we have Caleb Daniel, Bailey Smith and Isaac Rankin. Tier 4 is Luke Jackson, Jack McRae, Alex Neil-Bullen. And Tier 5, or part of Tier 5, rounding out the top 10, is Jeremy Cameron and Jesse Hogan. That's your top 10.
All right, Stevie, I'm going to throw this over to you and talk about some players that you want to dissect in the top 10 of Lekdog's ranks.
Well, I mean, that's a funny one. I'm not on Dylan Moore this year. I know a lot of people have got him plugged in at the top, but for me, when I'm ranking for, any position really, the number one thing I want to look at is role. And whilst Dylan Moore's been a fantastic scorer over the years, really just elite, he doesn't have a good role. So he actually doesn't tick that box for me in terms of where I think he's going to play. Whilst he can score well, I feel like maybe this is the team gets better. He shouldn't be able to score as well as he does, if that makes sense. I know it's kind of a silly thing to say. You just look at the scores year after year. Hey, he's great. But he's probably someone I'm just more okay with letting someone else draft, because he's not going to, shouldn't say not, he's probably not going to pop to that 105 plus that maybe you would hope from someone like a Jason Horne-Francis, maybe an Isaac Rankin.
Yeah, I don't think he does pop to 105. I think what's he been averaging between sort of 95 and 100 for the last few years. 98 last year, 91, 95 the year before. I think he falls around that 95 rank, which for forwards is pretty bloody good. Agree that there's question marks over the role. I do think he's slightly safer floor than Isaac Rankin, which is why I've got him ahead of Isaac Rankin. And for me, he seems to score in spite of the role that he has, and he's a very frustrating owner. Particularly, I had him in Classic all of last year, and you'd watch him, and it'd be quarter time, and he'd be sitting on 46 points, and then he'd just scrape his way to sort of 85 to 90 by the end of the game. So he can be a frustrating watch, but for me, I don't love the top half of the forwards. The exciting bits later on, but yeah, I think for me he's the second safest, in my opinion, forward option we have.
Yeah, builds his score from tackles a fair bit, which I know is something as well we don't necessarily like to rely on year to year, but I don't have any issue with him, but I also don't have him as high as second personally. Let's talk about a couple of guys making absolute waves, or let's talk about three guys making waves in salary cap circles before we talk about the top dog in Jason Horne-Francis. But Caleb Daniel, Bailey Smith, and Jack Macrae. Steve, are you as high on them having a massive impact coming into different clubs with role changes on the cards?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I actually am. So if we look at, one thing I like to do is look at how someone works within the team structure. Like, it has to work for real football as well as pretend football. So Caleb Daniel should be able to slot into that half-back line pretty well, I would have thought. That's been a pretty good scoring position across the year. I have him at F5. Bailey Smith, I like at the Geelong midfield. I think he should slot in there. I have him at F4. One thing they haven't had necessarily is great runners. I know they have Max Holmes as a good runner, but I think Bailey Smith can complement that. I'm not sure he's the most efficient player in the world, so maybe that's why he's not in the F1 conversation for me. And again, St Kilda, this is a really thin midfield. I think Jack Macrae can complement that team, should be able to slot in there, especially with the injury to Philippou. So there's really no one screaming. I mean, I look at what they rolled through there last year, and outside Jack Steele, it was pretty grim. So I think Jack Macrae, he's at F3 for me, so I'm really comfortable with all those guys.
Yeah, I actually have Macrae F2 in my rankings, so I've got the same at Jason Horne-Francis, but yeah, I'm massive on Jack Macrae. I want, is the room consensus? Are we happy with Horne-Francis? I mean, Steve, I'm massive on him playing fair bit of midfield time, but I have seen you pop a few tweets out there. You're not as high on the Port Adelaide midfield mix than perhaps the consensus of the community, but does that include a Jason Horne-Francis?
Oh, I really like Horne-Francis. I've got him at F2. He was a player I had last year, so got the nice breakout. I have got Rankin at number 1, which is probably a little bit contradictory. I also had Rankin last year. It was a great year for the Fizz team, let's be honest. So I have got Rankin at 1. I think he's probably similar to Moore in that he can score without the role, but I project him to have a little bit more of the role. And he's a very good player. He's going to get everything contested. It's all going to be hard-earned. I understand there may be some injury concerns or whatever, but I mean, he did miss games through suspensions. I'd like to think he learned his lesson, but he's also a player I love to watch.
Yeah, I mean, 5 names from the Phantom's Lair has been talking up Rankin as being playing a fair bit of midfield time in the practice matches or the preseason games that he's been seeing at the Crows internally. And then there's also been some news over here on, in Adelaide news cycles. I think it was a Channel 7 posted something recently that a lot of the Twitter community would have seen about Rankin saying he's eager to play some more midfield minutes. So I have him pretty high as well. But yeah, again, the top 10 ranks. Is there any other player? I mean, you mentioned Alex Neil-Bullen, Lekdog. Do you want to talk why you're so keen on him? We're talking about an Adelaide team that does have quite a bit of a midfield mix there. He's coming in to presumably play majority forward time.
I just think he's one of those guys that you look at the end of the year and he's in the top 10 for total points scored. Happened last year, 23 games for an average of 85. He doesn't miss games. Last year was his best career in terms of SuperCoach scoring, so I guess there's some risk that he returns to sort of a mid-70s average. But for me, like, when you contextualize it, we want Dylan Moore and Horne-Francis to go 100 plus. We think Daniel and Smith probably can go 90 plus, and Jack McRae, I've got a little bit lower, but we think he can probably get around that 100 mark. It's a pretty big drop off. If you're averaging 80 to 85, you're probably going to be close to the top 10 forward, and so he just sneaks in for me, just basically on availability. And I don't really need him to be midfield relevant to score those points. Presuming he can replicate what he did at the Demons.
Now, we mentioned on the last podcast, the Defender podcast, that Stevie Fizz was keen to tear the ranks to shreds. Was Alex Neil-Bullen one of those players that you want to talk about, Steve, in this setting?
I don't think Alex Neil-Bullen inspires that sort of emotion. He's such a boring player to own. Like, I can't get excited. To me, he's an outside player. He had a great year. Look at who Melbourne were missing last year. Like, there was points for anyone who could stand, vertical. So I'm not excited by Alex Neil-Bullen. It's like, drafting plain white toast for breakfast. It's just horrible. Who wants that? It's vanilla.
He did. I don't, and I haven't done the exact splits, or I don't have access to them. But it's not like he was only scoring his good games when he had CBAs. So he was still posting reasonable scores without them. And I think that's something that goes in his favour. But he is a very boring player, and similar to Lincoln McCarthy in years past, I think he'll be a top 10 forward come the start of 2026, because a couple of guys will lose status.
Last player I just want to touch on quickly, because you got a couple of key forwards in there. I think that's totally fine. They generally score pretty well, especially the Jeremy Camerons and Jesse Hogan, who round out your top 10. But I wanted to talk about Luke Jackson at 6 with you, Steve, as well. There's a lot of buzz, obviously, about Sean Darcy before his injury, his latest injury concern, but there's also talk about a Reedy maybe taking some ruck role, and Luke Jackson playing a mix of forward, mid, inside mid as well. Now we've heard out of there, ruck, inside mid, forward. Where do you see Luke Jackson? Where are you comfortable drafting him? Especially, he's got the forward ruck status.
Yeah, he's someone who I'm probably not drafting. I've got him at F12, and he's he's just an enigma, and I find those sort of players particularly hard to rank. I think he's a fantastic player. I think he's great. I don't know what the hell he's going to do. But it's actually interesting, Freo, with sort of mentioning about team context. And beyond the top dogs at Freo, there's kind of an interesting mix. You could tell yourself a few stories about who's going to fill that spot. So if Luke Jackson is playing as an extra on-baller, I can see that world, and he'll probably score okay. But he's just one of those guys I find particularly hard to rank because I don't know what to expect. Sort of like a Geelong player in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's a good call. Lekdog, do you want to take us through your 11 through 20 as we get deeper in these forward ranks?
Yep. So Tier 5 started with Cameron and Hogan in the top 10, and it continues for the key forward segment of the draft. It's Harry Mackay at 11, Charlie Curnow at 12, Shea Bolton in Tier 6 at 13, with Brent Daniels at 14 and Matthew Kennedy at 15. Tier 7 begins with Liam Baker, Mason Wood, Josh Treacy, Brian Myers, and Ben Keys rounds out the Tier 7 players there.
Stevie Fizz, any major players you want to touch on in the 11 through 20 ranks?
Probably Liam Baker. I have a F7, which probably seems high, but he's, I mentioned I value role particularly highly, and I would expect him to play a major role across that Eagles back line, especially if I'm projecting Duggan through the midfield, which I am. So I think there should be points on offer for Baker. Again, probably like Neil Bullen, he's maybe not particularly appealing, but I think he's one you can rub in your opponent's face and go, ha, 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 I got it right, when he comes out and scores well.
I have learned from my time with the Draft Doctors all those years ago, Stevie. I've got Liam Baker up at 9, so maybe I have learned a few things, projecting him to also play a bit more of a SuperCoach friendly role back there. So
let me just bump him down now. I've received that information. That's not what I want.
Yeah, I just think you time and time again, you see like even someone like a Jaden Hunt randomly come there and perform much better than what he ever would have thought at another club. And then Liam Baker coming from Richmond, I think he's going to have just a prime role wherever he plays, whether it's half-back, which that's all the news out of the West is that he'll be playing a half-back role, which, geez, in West Coast, we're not going to be very good this year. So you'd expect plenty of pill back there. I'm pretty big on Liam Baker. There's some other names here that some coaches are higher on. I'm not sure. I think I have them in the exact same spot, but you mentioned how hard it is to rank these Fremantle players. Shea Bolton at 13, Stevie Fizz, your thoughts?
I've got him at 14, and I think there's a world where he can push the top 10 pretty easily. Quality player. I'm not sure how much midfield time he sees, but he's an awesome, awesome player. So, yeah, a lot of upside there.
Brent Daniels' Lekdog had a pretty big average last year. If you're just looking based on SuperCoach average, he might go a fair bit higher. Why do you have him down at 14 overall in your forwards?
Look, had his career best year last year, 21 games, average 90 was really good. I think there's scope for him to repeat that. He's one of those players that they really value. I think they might have even signed him long term in the off season, if I'm remembering correctly. But the flip side of that is he's literally never done it before. So sort of floundered between 60 and 70s in the past for SuperCoach scoring. So there's enough question marks for me. I think he probably provides more value than where I've got him sitting. But there's just enough question marks for me that I'd probably rather take a couple of guys ahead of him.
Another player moving clubs in the off season, coming in at 15 with Matt Kennedy, forward mid eligible. Steve, you got any interest in Kennedy? He's been bounced around, doesn't get a heap of time on ground when he plays, but now he's got the added benefit of being under Bevo.
Yeah, he's at 15 as well for me, and I'm still not quite sure why. I think it's Stato, because Stato loves Matt Kennedy, and it's just rubbed off over the years. I'm not really a huge Matt Kennedy guy. I suspect because I'll have players slightly higher than consensus when it comes to that range, I'll be able to pivot. But in gut feeling, when he's one of those players where you rank him, and then I always do this thing before the draft, and I'll look at the player and I'll just go to the player next to him, and I'm like, would I really draft him over him? And Matt Kennedy's someone who I'll be like, no, and then drop him a spot, no, drop him, and that's kind of how it is for me. Very role dependent.
And it's the hardest team to know what the role's going to be. In theory, he's a perfect replacement for what Jack McRae should have been doing, playing midfield, but wasn't playing midfield. And even at the Blues, Kennedy's issue was he was good enough to be in the best 23, but there wasn't a role for him. So 1 week he was halfback, 1 week he was key forward, 1 week he was inside mid. So I suspect that probably doesn't actually change, to be honest, but there's scope for him to score, I don't know, in the 80s pretty consistently.
I think just quickly, I'm not going to talk about him long, don't worry. At 17, Mason Wood, I'm completely off him. I just don't think this year he can replicate what he has in the past couple of years, playing an amazing job on the wing, getting on in time, but not just that. I think they're going to need his size elsewhere in the ground, and I think they're going to have to start using some of these younger guys in those prime roles up the ground. Who knows? He might replicate, but I'm doing what I think, Steve, you mentioned on the Defender pod. If you're off someone, you slot him way further down your ranks. So that's pretty much where I'm at with Mason Wood. I'm not interested at all. Let's get through your 21 through 30, Lek, and then we'll talk about some sleepers.
Let's do it. So, Tier 8, Toby Green, Patrick Lipinski, Connor McDonald, Jake Waterman, Sam Darcy, Kyle Langford. Interesting bunch of names there. And then Tier 9 will round out the top sort of 30. Jai Simpkin, Tom Papley, Cam Rayner, Sam Powell Pepper, who some say based his look on me. And then just outside the top 30, but within Tier 9 is Riley Sanders.
Throw to you, Stevie Fizz, again for your thoughts to dissect the 21 through 30 forward ranks.
I'm probably far more interested in Riley Sanders. I have it F17. Probably far more interested. Actually, I'm probably interested in a lot of these players, like Sam Darcy, Kyle Langford at 19. Mason Wood's down here at 26 for me, so I'm far more interested in these guys. Like Thrillthorpe, I have it F13. So, yeah, Simpkin I've got at F10. He's probably in that crummy roll, good scorer bracket that, you could throw Brent Daniels in. So, yeah, I mean, this is where the variation's going to come, and you're going to either find winners or losers in your draft, I think.
Yeah, where did you say you had Sanders? So we didn't mention Riley Sanders just outside the top 30, but again, these ranks were done pre-injuries, but they were also done pre-hype. Lekdog, a bit of the Riley Sanders hype has come. Would you adjust him up now that, we've heard tearing up the track sort of stuff? Are you going to go a bit higher on him from 31?
Yeah, I need to see the role. I don't really listen to the track watchers as much as I love them and bless them and good on them for getting the day off to go down and watch. I just don't have it in me to take it seriously. If Riley Sanders was really a part of Bevo's plan, I just think we would have seen more of that last year. Maybe he's come on really well in the off-season. Probably got him a little bit low, but to me, I'd just rather take the floor of some of the guys, some of the boring picks ahead of him. But I get the hype. Like, he's a good player. He should have been playing last year. He probably should have been playing him. Yeah, anyway, we don't need to get into what Bevo's doing with his team. He's a decent player, but I just would rather the security and some of the guys I have ahead of him. You did mention Tillthorpe, who is actually not even in my ranking, so he may have just completely missed out by accident. So that's why we check these. But I don't know. Sam Darcy was another one where people are sort of. I think he's a better footballer than he is SuperCoach player, and I'm not sure exactly what that looks like this year. So I was happy to just bump him down a little bit lower. Simpkin was one that I do feel I have a risk at 27 just in terms of it being low. But again, we talk about Jai Simpkin. This is the year for Jai Simpkin. It feels like a lot. And I know he once was a decent SuperCoach player, but I don't know. I just need to see it. That's what it boils down to with a lot of these guys. I need to see it before I believe it.
I'm actually pretty, my first ranking where I put this guy was actually embarrassingly high, so I won't even mention how high it was, but I'm pretty big on Sam Darcy, actually. I know he's still a young player, but, coming into, I think it's his 4th year in the system now. He had a reasonable, I think, 22 or odd. He was in the ruck contest a fair bit, at least last season. A little taste of it with splitting with Tim English. I think that'll just grow a little bit, especially, Tim English with some abdominal concerns. He might start the season on fire as well, but it doesn't matter how much ruck time this guy gets. He's just going to kick bags. And we see the likes of guys like, you've got Jesse Hogan at 10, Mackay and Kerno up in that sort of top 15 bracket. I can easily see Sam Darcy moving into that bracket this season and possibly, as I said, embarrassingly high into the top 10 and maybe high up into the top 10. But Stevie, any players we've touched on here that you want to delve into deeper?
So my boy Jesse Hogan, I can't have it. I can't have it at 10. Had him last year because you could draft him really nicely. And what I like to do, just listeners, is I like to bracket up my key forwards because it's a really crummy position to play. But some of them pop, but the swings are wild, right? The swings are, you go from 85 to 71 to, you see what I'm saying? And so everything went right for Jesse Hogan last year. Absolutely everything. He kicked straight. He won his one-on-ones at just an absolute ridiculous rate. Now, I don't expect him to be able to do those same things to that level again. Like it all happened and it all clicked, and I love seeing it for the player. But in terms of fantasy, he's had, whatever you think about Jake Stringer, he should be internal competition in that forward line. You should see some growth from Aaron Cadman, I would suspect. Toby Green had statistically a year where if his name wasn't Toby Green, he'd probably be in the VFL. So if those sort of players can come, take something out of Jesse Hogan's mouth, I'd rather see that in someone else's team, I'll put it that way, despite loving the player.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I listened to a podcast earlier in the week and they predicted that he would kick 30 goals in a 3-week stretch this year. So, it's it's a vast contrast. I think that's all very, very, very fair points.
It's interesting, yes. And probably just the impact of the package, Steve. You're worried about the big package coming in there and stealing a few snags.
Well, I think it's the collective. The idea of the collective,
no,
and I'm not expecting. I don't expect GWS to be as good. I know sort of people are putting them in the flag bracket. I'm more on they might be touchy on the 8. So, and that's why we make predictions so people can rip us at the end of the year and go, you don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's also why I love draft in that, we're talking about a Jesse Hogan and where we should put him, whereas he's just never a conversation in classic. Generally, I mean, he was probably in a few teams last year for a stretch, but. It is awesome to be talking about these things at this time of year. I want to touch on a player that was probably much higher on our rankings before a preseason injury. Steve, where can we take a player like Matthias Philippou, who was, I don't know how high he was on your ranks before the injury, but he's going to miss a bunch of rounds. Can you even take this guy? Depends on your bench setup, obviously, but where would you be comfortable taking a guy with high potential but that's injured to start the year?
So I've got him at F34, so you can certainly draft him. And I put him in a range where the players I'm selecting, they would have a lower percentage, I feel, of being in my team come round 6. If you're in a league, you would generally churn sort of the players who are you're drafting sort of after pick 120, let's say. They can, work out, they don't work out, etc. So the only thing I would say to your listeners is I would be careful drafting too many injured players, because if you've got, say, a 4-person bench, that is it's 25% of your bench that you really can't churn through to find the value picks at the start of the year. And that's when things happen. It's someone you didn't expect gets that midfield time. Someone looks amazing in a role. Maybe Zach, like a Zach Bailey, maybe he gets all this awesome point scoring at Brisbane. Maybe Eric Hipwood, God forbid he, starts clunking them and kicking 70 goals sort of thing. But it could happen, right? So if you have too many injured players on your bench, you are limiting your potential to find the best players off the waiver wire. Because if you draft Matthias Philippou, you're drafting him to sit to wait that injury out.
Yeah, I actually agree. I don't draft and stash injured guys for that reason, because it's hard to justify a guy you've held for 5 weeks like Matthias Philippou, who you drafted with the intent of keeping, when there's a guy on the waiver wire who's had 2 or 3 good games. He might pop. You've got an opportunity to get him, but you go, you sort of that sunk cost fallacy. You've already invested this time and draft capital into a Philippou. So I actually just completely avoid myself the injured guys and let someone else either reap the rewards or carry that burden.
I do want to touch on one thing, Stevie, before we'll get into sleepers in just a second. But I know in the past, you've been traditionally a fan of streaming forwards. Is that still the case now? And maybe could you just explain the general concept of streaming to our audience as well?
Yeah, sure. So when we're streaming forwards, it's we're playing matchups. So let's say Richmond, for example, this year, if you expect Richmond to be getting beaten by 10 goals on the regular, rather than hanging on to an Eric Hipwood or Zach Bailey every week who might score you 70, you're looking to play someone off the waiver wire who has that tasty matchup against the vulnerable opposition, and you're hoping for a 20 to 25 point bump on that. Maybe they score 100. We've certainly streamed crummy players in the past. The legend, I still remember streaming them back to back. Johnny Butcher and Levi Casbolt both tunning up in back-to-back weeks. So the pride of Mafra himself. And that's why I like taking my shots at the end of the draft on these key forwards, or whoever the forward is, because they're so easy to throw back in the pool if it doesn't work out, if they don't get that generous role, if they don't get that market share, if the team looks worse than you expect, and you can stream on those matchups.
So kind of you're throwing like one or two. Would you? How many would you leave on your bench? I mean, again, depends on team structure. But say we've got 5 or 4 forwards. Would you want 1 or 2 in that slot just to throw away basically and stream each week?
I mean, I don't want to stream any. Ideally, everyone I draft works out. But I would hate to have more than 2 out of 5. I think once you get beyond that, you rely because these guys won't always work out. Like, let's not. Nick Larkey could be playing Richmond, but he might just have a dirty day and the ball keeps getting kicked at his feet or over his head and that sort of thing. So it doesn't always work out. And the more of these guys you're rostering on field each week, the more you need to go in your favour.
Yeah, it would be scary coming finals time as well if you do get one of those down weeks and trying to rely on a stream. But it is an interesting strategy anyway. Let's get into our sleepers. Lekdog, do you want to kick it off with who you're looking to target quite late in draft that you think will provide value for these forwards?
Yeah, so he might be, to be honest, I've been focusing on draft. He might be getting a little bit of hype in salary cap, but Neil Erasmus is on my radar. I'm an apologist for him. I was invested in him in his draft year, and back into last year in the waffle. I know it's the waffle, but he was averaging sort of high 20s, low 30s, getting really high tackle numbers. I think there's a spot in that inside mid, assuming that your Nat Fyfes of the world and stuff continue to shift forward. So I believe there's an opportunity for Neil Erasmus. I wouldn't be grabbing him for an on-field position, but I'd be trying to grab him sort of for one of those bench spots and hoping he, in your words, Fizz, pops. So he's one I've got my eye on. There's very little AFL evidence that he can put it together at that level, but he's just someone that I've been keen on his whole career, and I just want him to have that opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's more than just a little bit of classic hype there, so I'd be interested to see where he does go in SuperCoach drafts. Stevie, who have you got as a late sleeper in our forward line?
Yeah, there's some pretty filthy names out here.
Yeah,
but I will have a look at Jack Graham just with the injuries in the Eagles midfield. I don't really love it. I think Nick Watson's interesting.
Yes, the wizard.
It's kind of filthy how much press this guy's getting, but I can't leave a draft without some shares in him. The stats this guy had last year were just absolutely mind-blowing. The one-on-one win rate, the ground balls, all that sort of stuff, just absolutely phenomenal. So if you think Hawthorn are going to be a good team, you can have a little bit of him. And again, I would like to shop in the Brisbane forward line. Obviously, Joe Danaher retiring was a bit of a steal for players last year. If you're expecting Brisbane to win a lot of games, I think there's worse areas to shop than... Hey, he's a player. He's a player, right? He's absolutely a player in the AFL. It could happen. So Zach Bailey, Charlie Cameron, they're sort of players who, if it doesn't work out, they're streamers. You throw them in the pool, play them on matchups, whatever. But could do worse.
Well, just on that theory, I quite like Kyle Lohmann, actually, who recently re-signed with the Lions. So yeah, one of those guys has got to pick up the slack of the goal scoring. I really like Kyle Lohmann, the way that he performed towards the end of last year. Very small sample, but I really like him. And I just looked up the numbers on Watson, which includes finals. But for his last 12 games, so he got dropped to the VFL, had a really slow start. The Wizard, 76 Supercoach average in his last 12 games after getting dropped, which includes a couple of lower scores. So he really could really popped. I quite like that as a sleeper as well, because he's only got the 60 odd something like that average next to his name, but it was due to that incredibly slow start, which was big in the media at the time as well. So yeah, Stevie Fizz always bringing some gold, as does Lekdog as well. That is the episode for our forwards on Drafted. That's also the rankings episodes all done and dusted as well. We're going to be looking at coming back at you with maybe one or two more pods before the season. But then we'll be getting into in season. It will be looking at waivers. So we've got that coming your way. That's, the rankings are done, lads. Rankings season. We're going to have to obviously make some adjustments following these trial games, following these practice matches. There's going to be a fair bit of adjusting as well. But
no,
thanks
I'm pretty
very
confident
much.
I've nailed it. I don't think there'll be that.
So, yeah. Well, thanks very much for joining us, Lekdog. You can catch Lekdog's top 100 ranks and a bunch of other articles. We'll be looking at a mock draft that we've been doing. That article is going to be up on Code Sports. I'll chuck any of these links in the description, but make sure you check out Code Sports for all our SuperCoach Draft and Classic content this preseason. And Stevie Fizz, I'll give your draft kit another shout out as well that we mentioned on the last episode. Just let us know where we can find that.
Yeah, it's on the draftdoctors.com.au website, which redirects you to whatever the hell website it's actually being sold on. Please check out the podcast website, all the articles, all that good stuff. It's almost as good as Code Sports, they tell me.
Almost, Stevie Fizz. Make sure you go listen to the Draft Doctors if you're not already. That's it, lads. Episode of Drafted, done and dusted. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.